Hello and welcome to Policy Watch, your weekly snapshot of the biggest business stories, their context, their relevance and impact. I'm Govindraj, Ethiraj. India's GDP numbers are looking quite healthy, if not strong, 7.5% considering the revised numbers. But aggregate net profit, on the other hand, of Indian corporates or India Inc. is not looking as strong. A report in Business Standard says that aggregate net profit of 2,941 companies shrunk nearly 17% from a year ago. So what's happening? Why is it that corporate net profits are not syncing with GDP numbers? Well, I'm going to find this out from two guests who are joining me. Their names are Dhanajay, Sinha, Economist at Emkay Global, and Avinash, Gorashankar, Director at Mint Research. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. So, Avinash, let me begin with you. I think one of the concerns is that while we keep GDP numbers aside for a moment, which are obviously good, corporate numbers are not. So the question is, one is, why are corporate numbers looking like this? And secondly, is there something more fundamentally wrong?
Govind, I think very clearly, corporate earnings for Q3 have been very disappointing. In fact, much worse than what the markets expected. If you look at the banking sector, if you look at capital goods, I think both these sectors have a big weightage on the markets. Clearly, if you see banking, PSU banking has been extremely bad. I think we saw a lot of negative surprises from large banks like Bank of Baroda, PNB, Canara Bank. My sense is, I think, loan book growth has been pretty weak. I think there's a lot of liquidity in the system, but credit demand is yet to pick up. In case of capital goods, very poor numbers from both BHEL as well as L&T. BHEL, I think, if you see the operating performance for 9 quarters, profits are down. I think order book has not increased, moved up.
Right.
And more importantly, I think on the ground activity clearly suggests that demand is yet to pick up, orders have yet to come in. So I think, these GDP numbers are clearly a play on the statistical index value, which we saw from 6.9 to 7.4%. Ground level reality is companies are still saying that probably another couple of quarters demand may take some time.
Right.
So I think, broadly, this is the kind of reality. I think if markets have to be seen in that context, it's
right.
more of sentiment and liquidity.
When you say BHEL and L&T, so they're also in a sense reflective of the larger capital goods slowdown in the economy.
Exactly.
Right. Okay. Dhanajay, what's your sense? Why are numbers? I mean, let's keep GDP aside for a moment. But why are corporate numbers looking so weak at this point of time, considering that we thought things were going well?
See, first a little bit on the GDP numbers. So the GDP numbers before the revisions were actually fairly modest. So the GDP growth was somewhere around 5% in real terms. What has happened is, with the change in base, there has been a certain amount of adjustment in terms of data collection and the methodology. As a result of that, what has happened is what the government is, the CSO is claiming is that there is a productivity benefit that has happened. The efficiency of capital, etc., is improved. Statistically, that's what the interpretation is. And hence, notwithstanding the fact that nominal GDP decelerated to less than 10% growth, the productivity enhancement somehow translated into higher real GDP growth.
Okay.
That's the revision part of it.
Okay.
But that's quite detached from what's the ground reality. The biggest, before coming to this year, if you look back into previous year, the previous year shows that the financial savings of the private corporates increased. And if you look at the data, that data shows that retained earnings of private companies increased by a whopping 27%. Now, if you look at RBI's data, it calculates.
So what does that mean? What is the significance of retained earning going up?
Retained earnings
people had nothing to spend on? Or?
No, retained earnings means that whatever companies make as profit after dividend, whatever the amount that you retain is the retained earnings.
Correct.
So if the retained earnings is growing at 27%, obviously the profit should also be growing significantly higher.
Right.
So I think there is a considerable mismatch, because if you look at any aggregation that you do yourself, or any official aggregation, if you consider RBI as an aggregator, it shows that in the previous year, in FY14, the profit actually contracted by something like 3%. In the previous year also, it was contraction of 5%. And this is a very large set of companies, something like 2,000, 3,000 set of companies. So if you consider the GDP number, if that is showing a 27% growth in profits, it means that you have incorporated many unincorporated companies and firms that is not visible in terms of the listed space, which are actually showing that kind of, or possibly showing. I mean, I'm assuming that that's where it is coming from. Because all the listed players have not, or incorporated companies have not shown that kind of
so let's
growth.
keep GDP aside. I mean, let's keep the contrast aside and focus on the absolute.
Now, if you come to the current scenario, I don't think it's a surprise surprise. It is at all a surprise actually, because this was a significant amount of hope that was built in for FY15 and FY16. Now, if you look at FY16 and FY15, the consensus 15 and 16, the consensus earnings after the change of guard in the government was to the tune of 17 to 20% for FY15 and 16, depending on which house you take. That's the general perception. But as things have panned out, if you look at this year, the aggregate profit growth for Nifty companies or even Sensex companies will not be more than 5%. Right?
Okay.
So,
but that sounds quite scary. But anyway,
it will be. So the thing is that this quarter there is a contraction. There's actually a contraction if you look at the Sensex and Nifty as well. The previous quarter also is a very low single-digit growth. And the previous quarter, the first quarter was a strong growth in terms of profit, but aggregate earnings is very, very modest.
Right.
So if you look back 2012 to 2014 FY, the average profit growth for Sensex and Nifty is about 10%. Why is it not a surprise? Essentially, what has to be understood is that for the first quarter FY15, there was a significant benefit that you are getting by way of depreciation in the currency. Rupee depreciated significantly in the September quarter 2013. It went to something like 67, 68. And you had a significant benefit coming from rupee depreciation for 4 quarters. On a year
that is sort of evened out.
That has evened out, number one. Number two thing is that we were of the opinion that the tax revenue of the government will not be happening. Right? The tax elasticity, if you look at 5-year average, has decreased to 0.8 versus 1.6 in 2007. So the robustness of tax generation has actually come down. Hence, the ability of government to actually spend also reduces. As the government, you remember, government has actually embarked upon austerity measures, right? So they curtailed spending, etc.
So that spending also means low spending means low investment.
Came down.
Okay, let me come back to you in a second, Dhanajay. Avinash, if we were to now spin forward, right? So we are saying that this is where it is. We are still sort of seeing in a shrinking environment when it comes to profit. What lies ahead? Are we at a point where things are turning around or beginning to turn around?
I think clearly even the fourth quarter, Govind, will be a disappointing quarter. I think Dhanajay is right in saying, I think this year earnings growth for Nifty companies, my senses should not be more than 7-8%. And earlier I think this was roughly about 15 to 16%. So I think the only hope is that obviously the rate cycle gets accelerated. We get a bigger rate cut after the budget, and I think interest rate definitely has a positive impact on at least making the sentiment positive. So I think investment revival is going to be one area. As I was saying earlier, that investment revival has stopped. I think capital formation in the economy has to again kickstart, and you'll probably find only then the capital goods players will actually get more orders. There will be more jobs. The Make in India kind of program which Mr. Modi has said is definitely a good direction. He's talking about opening up the defense sector. He's talking about Clean India campaign. So wherever I think more money will be spent and capex will be encouraged.
But this sounds like it will take time. You're talking about another 18 months to 24 months for things to kick
I think optimistically, I think I am hopeful that possibly in the December quarter for FY16 we could see some signs of revival. But clearly for the first half, I think it's going to be more on sentiment, because the markets have always got very high expectations.
So you spoke about capital goods, right? You talked about L&T and BHL. What about the consumer demand? How are things there?
There also, I think if you look at volume growth, which is the key determinant, I think has been quite disappointing. You look at Hindustan Lever, you look at ITC. I think the key element is that even rural demand is now a little soft, and I don't think it's going to happen dramatically that you're going to see double-digit growth. ITC has a different problem. If the government takes a very strong regulatory aspect, in effect, it's going to impact volume growth, which is going to be a key driver for them. If you talk about lever also, I think good numbers on the bottom line, but if you talk about volume growth, much below the market expectation.
And you're saying this applies across, even white goods, brown goods,
I would say that, I think once the rate cut cycle happens, maybe white goods, or for that reason, some consumer items like, there were companies like Britannia or maybe something like a Bajaj Corp, which actually surprised the markets. So, it could happen that maybe some elements or some products may obviously not be that badly impacted, but the broad story is if a lever shows a volume growth which is not in line with what which is positive, I think it clearly shows that demand is weak.
Okay, fair enough. So Dhanajay, if you were to now look ahead, when do you see things turning? What could be the bright spots and not so bright spots?
See, the thing is that I have been looking at this cycle, and I broadly know how long will it take, and it's going to be a long process.
Okay.
And it has been, right? So the thing is, if you look at the investment cycle, as he was saying, the thing that is relevant for investment cycle is the top line growth of companies, right? And the return on capital employed, whether the companies have deleveraged or not. If you look at the sales growth for companies, this quarter we have seen a decline, a contraction on a year-on-year basis, something like a 2-3% contraction. Typically, there is a 2-year lag of between the investment cycle and the sales growth, right? So we have taken a view that it will be quite some time before investment cycle picks up. The other positive thing that can happen from the budget is that if the government tries to allocate more allocation in favor of capital outlay versus revenue spending, it can possibly do that. Given the context that you have low commodity prices, possibly you have a lower subsidy burden, so you can actually allocate a little more. So that can be a possible trigger at the margin. But let's say something like 85% of the total investment is private. So that is more dependent on the sales growth, the top line growth, the leverage, balance sheet. The balance sheet is still leveraged.
And the ability of banks to lend. I mean,
ability of banks to lend and the return on capital employed. All these things have to happen. This is going to take a long time. You need to have a scenario where commodity prices remain low, inflation is low, and eventually, interest rates also come off. So
let me ask you a flip question, Avinash. And so we were, there is a general sense of things looking up, right? Of course, of late you've had a industry leader who said that things are not looking up, and that's really perhaps in keeping with the numbers that you're both talking of. But if things are looking good, if the sentiment has been so far somewhat good, could this not translate or accelerate the change or turnaround that we're talking about?
No, I think some amount of improvement has happened for some sectors. Like if you see commercial vehicles, I think recently Ashok Leyland showed a very strong volume growth number. Of course, it was on a very low base, but even currently, the management has gone on record and said that for FY16 they are looking at a 20% volume growth. So
commercial vehicles do represent the larger economy.
Largely economy. So commercial vehicles are definitely turning around, and I think clearly FY16 would see a revival, because for the last 2-3 years this industry has actually seen negative growth. The same thing for passenger cars. Once the rate cut cycle starts, you're going to see good volume growth, because the last 2-3 years have not been anything great. So,
so if I'm getting it right, so you're saying if there is a rate cut or there is encouragement on the rate front, and of course there is a sense of macro push, things could improve. Dhanajay, quickly, we're running out of time.
So
what's the 1 or 2 things that we need to get things going?
So the thing is, it depends on the number one thing that I said was government has to allocate more on the capital outlay. So that's something that even if it means somewhat higher fiscal deficit, higher capital outlay can be a positive thing. See, the reforms with respect to the agriculture sector, the FCI thing that's been talked about, high level committee has come up with certain recommendation, implementation of the recommendation to ensure that food inflation and inflation in general remains low while you allocate more capital investment is very significant.
Right. So you're saying a few more policy steps on that front, but broadly, it's time to put the feet on the accelerator, step up spending, maybe lower interest rates, draw more consumers in. Hopefully things should turn around, but it's not going to happen in a hurry. Right. That's a good point to take away. Thank you very much for joining us. We have to take a break on Policy Watch. We'll come back on the other side and talk about some of the expectations from the union budget on the tax front. Stay with us. Welcome back to Policy Watch. 2015 Union Budget is coming up, and the tax folks are quite keen to know what's going to happen in the budget when it comes to both direct and indirect tax. There is particular interest to see what India will do in the spirit when it comes to tax and tax avoidance issues, as well as some of the larger litigations that have been hanging on the tax front when it comes to India. Joining me now to discuss this, Akshay Kenkre, partner at TransPrice, and Pranav Kapadia, chairman of the Indirect Taxes Committee of the Chamber of Tax Consultants. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us today. So Akshay, let me begin with you. Let me start. What are the key things that you're looking out for from the direct tax point of view?
See, from a direct tax point of view, maybe we can bifurcate these key things into two parts. One can be the changes in the rates, and one which really India needs changes sometimes in the policy framework. Maybe let's take first the rates part. If you look at the rates part, there has been a gradual increase in the basic exemption limit for individuals. Now, right now, I see that is realistically could hover around 3 lakhs to 3,50,000 this year. And the ATC benefit which they had, that could go around 2 lakhs. So the government might think of increasing up to 5 lakhs as a total benefit for an individual, which seems as a fair share given to an individual.
But just so you're saying, but basically the exemption should be increased.
Exemption should be increased, definitely, but we should not expect the basic exemption to go to 5 lakhs, but somehow sum it up, 3 lakhs plus 2 lakhs, 2 lakhs more as an investment-based or investment-based deduction.
So we'll come to whether the government can afford it. So on the individual side, you're saying that things should get better. What about the corporate side? Let's look at the top headline.
Right. Now, looking at the corporate side, I think there has to be a boost as far as corporate side is concerned, and there has to be more FDIs inflows in the market. Now, what UK basically did is it lowered down the corporate taxes. Now, our corporate taxes hover around 30% plus surcharge and education cess. Now, if we can just
cut effective rate?
33.99 is what.
No, I'm saying effective. What do corporates actually pay if you were to do all the subtractions and additions in India?
That effective tax rate really depends. But if you really look at proper tax planning, somewhere around 30%. But really the subject matter is right now rates. So if you look at the overall rate, if you can lower it down to around 28%, 2% decrease itself and getting more of a kick start for most of the investors that are looking into India. Maybe.
So you're saying if you were to look at the macroeconomic point of view, what India needs currently is lower tax rates so as to stimulate more investment.
Absolutely, and that's what even other countries have done. So we could also follow that.
So in a competitive world at this point of time, we need to do something like that so as to stimulate investment.
Absolutely.
Let's look at indirect taxes. What's the sort of pending agenda? I'm assuming GST is the big one.
GST is the main agenda, I think, and all the corporates and all the individuals are looking forward for GST. It's pending since a long time, and the integration of excise and VAT and service tax into GST is one big thing that every individual is looking forward, and that would possibly bring the simplification of taxes. The multiplication of taxes that is happening, the multiple factors, the multiple assessments that are happening, I think that is one place where that thing can be brought into place, and also a unified tax rate across India. I think that is the main factor that people
So we've been talking about GST for a while. So what can happen in the Union Budget 2015 that will sort of take this whole process forward, or should happen?
Well, I think first of all, a roadmap for GST needs to be declared. A white paper on GST can come, or maybe the draft rules can go. We have already had a amendment of the constitution, the proposed amendment of the constitution that has come. But what we need is the draft rules, the draft GST Act that is going to formulate, and it should be placed in public domain. Let the comments and suggestions come from the public and the corporate sector at large, that these are the things or these are the hindrances in the implementation of GST. I think that will be helpful if such an announcement comes in the budget.
Correct. Okay. So what's happening today because we don't have a GST? What's going wrong?
Because since GST is not there, excise assessments are separate, excise is separate, VAT is separate, service tax is separate. Secondly, all interstate movements, the planning, the taking of forms from the persons to whom we have sold the goods, the branch stamps, the F forms, the C forms. I think the people are very much worried on the fact because forms don't come from the purchaser, and it is the seller who is getting penalized. So one big thing that we are looking for is that this issuance of forms, this system of issuance of forms by the purchaser should be stopped under the GST, and this is what is expected by the
So GST is one key thing. What are the other indirect tax expectations, very broadly?
I think the housing sector, which is levied with VAT and service tax, this is one sector, and in the infrastructure sector, it should be relieved of VAT and service tax levy, because roti, kapda or makan, as we say, makan is the basic necessity for an individual, and for that levy of VAT and service tax both has been put up on the citizens of India, and I think that is one big thing which needs to be exempted under
so housing sector. So let me come back to you for other sectors. Akshay, very broadly again, are we in a position to afford it? So you said reduce interest, tax rates for for companies, increase the exemptions that the individual citizen gets. So that also means that the bill is going to go up.
Sure.
Right?
Sure.
Can we afford it?
That's a very valid question, but what the government is really looking at this point of time is maybe to get that FDI in the market. Now, on one hand, we are talking of a Make in India, but what is Make in India if we are not able to promote Make in India from a tax point of view? So, if not a cut in tax rate, maybe we can look at more of a policy changes. We can look at few tax holidays linked to the manufacturing sector, which might boost it. So somehow, as you are saying, there would have been, or there would be, or it's expected that there has to be a cut in the revenue that will get in, and that might widen out the fiscal deficit that we are looking at. But somehow the government will have to have this tightrope walking.
Right. Okay. So what are the kind of policy changes? I'm saying, okay, so let's keep the direct the taxes as well as the exemptions on one side.
True.
What are the other areas that we're looking at in terms of making the whole tax administration system better or simpler?
Right. Since 2012, there has been a regime of retrospective taxes which has been going on. So although in the July budget there has been a clarification that there will not be any such type of retrospective taxes henceforth, and it's really not very encouraging for the people of the country as well as the other investors. It's very important that there should be some clarification on whatever has already been placed in the
So
act,
you're saying
because
that's still hanging.
that is still hanging. I mean, if you look at few of the retrospective amendments which have happened, there has to be at least a guidance. You should not go back to 1961 for retrospective. I mean, that was showing a clear, maybe a frustration from the policymakers, saying that we have to go to 1961 to clarify our view, that we always meant it to be this way. Maybe retrospective tax, 1-2 years down the line. Understood.
So retrospective is the other sort of hanging whatever issue.
True.
What else is should be the government looking at in this budget?
I think government should be really, as I said, boosting investments, and that could be done through various international agreements, maybe looking at the advanced pricing agreements in place, fastening it up. There has been more than 400 APAs clocked in after the APA regime has come in, and I think hardly few have come out. So they should start maybe processing the APAs and then building in the investors' confidence. That is very important.
What is APA, for our viewers?
Yes, APAs is advanced pricing agreements. Right. So before you get into a transaction, you can enter into an agreement with the government and fix up the prices, saying that what type of profitability they would make over maybe a period of 5 years. And now there is already a rollback also of APAs for the previous 4 financial years, but still rules on that are expected. So if you are coming out with such a type of initiative, maybe that should be closed very fast, and that active involvement from a government perspective needs to be
right. So, and that also sort of leads to the whole transfer pricing issue, where India has 70% of the world's transfer pricing litigation pending, you were saying earlier.
Yeah, that's correct. Somehow transfer pricing as a subject has been looked up from a collection point of view, which I feel that it's an anti-avoidance law. It leads to double taxes, leads to a lot of litigation, leads to a lot of time of courts that has been involved. So what I feel is we really need to, or the policymakers and administration really needs to look at transfer pricing as an anti-avoidance law and not a collection tool, that the year-on-year targets keep on increasing and there might be some unfair additions or the aggressive additions which have already been made. I don't say that all taxpayers are paying absolutely correct taxes, but surely there has to be again a balance on what type of aggressiveness pedal you really want to push it.
Right. So I'm going to ask you 2 questions to close. Let me begin with you, Pranav. So there is a spirit and there is the law, right? From a spirit point of view, what are you expecting from this budget? And then we'll come to the law. I mean, in any case, there you've talked about GST and a couple of other things on service tax.
Yeah, from a spirit point of view, I think the main emphasis I would like to put on is the taxation of goods and services. What is happening as of now is there are few services which are deemed sales transactions as well as declared services. Now there is a dual taxation on them. Services are the service portion is being charged to service tax. The goods portion is being charged to VAT. But there is an overlapping amongst them, and most of the traders and contractors in such cases, they are hit by dual taxation, and it is ultimately the consumer.
Give me an example?
I can give you an example, say the software industry.
Okay.
Now in the software industry, VAT is levied on sale of software. Service tax is also levied under the information technology products. So companies are charging both VAT and service tax on the same component, which should not be levied. Secondly, restaurant
so from
services.
a spirit point of view, you're saying that there is, there is a sense of lack of clarity.
Lack of clarity is there, and such other points. We can just add the restaurant services there, works contract services is there, leasing services are there, software services. In all these cases, I think I would like to make a suggestion to the government in this. Although these are points which are taken care of by the Constitution's 366(29)(a), but in the budget, at least if they can bring out a point that on whatever transaction value VAT is being charged, on that value service tax should not be charged, and vice versa. So the state government as well as central government. The central government has to initiate this, and then all the state governments will have to follow it.
Right.
I think that is one major factor which will free out much of the litigation and the cost factor to the individuals also.
Okay. This thing, Akshay, last word quickly. What's the spirit?
Maybe before getting into spirit, maybe two important points from me from the investor's point of view are the general anti-avoidance rule, which are hanging there and which would come from 2016 if the budget says yes, which says that it still needs to be deferred. But there again, on one hand, you have an agenda to curtail black money, and on one side we are saying, okay, we'll postpone GAR. What the government could do is maybe they could look at giving a clear direction on how a GAR needs to be implemented, even if it's 2017. That is very important. Just not to get that law incorporated and then left to maybe imaginations how it is getting implemented. So maybe in spirit, I would say implementation is the key, whichever law comes in. And India is looking at and cooperating with OECD on the base erosion and profit shifting. Now there are a lot of recommendations that the panel has given even in the G20 meetings, and there has been white papers on that, and there has been discussions. Now whatever are discussions, India is a party to it, and India would take those recommendations in. Now we need to see in how they would be looking at, or how they would be incorporated in our Direct Tax or Income Tax Act, because it needs a substantial reframework when something called as BEPS or base erosion and profit shifting needs to be looked into. So we could also get few hints on what the government is looking at while dealing with maybe the issue of base erosion and profit shifting.
Right. So that's to do with sort of harmonizing with global laws and in taxation.
True.
As a spirit or as a rule.
Absolutely.
Right. Okay.
Absolutely.
We've run out of time, gentlemen. Thank you very much for
Thanks
being
a
with
lot.
us. Well, that's all we have time for on Policy Watch this week. We'll be back next week, same time. Thank you.